Hey, Detoxers. Welcome to another episode of the Disinfo Detox. Today, we are joined by Pete Etchells, professor of psychology and science communication at Bath Spa University. And he just published a new book, Unlocked: The Real Science of Screen Time and How to Spend It Better. Pete, welcome to the Disinfo Detox.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Let me ask you this question before we get into the book, which is great. Um, in the title, you have the real science of screen time. So tell our audience what makes your book worthy of the screen time to have it in the title as compared to other books, let's say.
Cool. There's a question to start off with. Maybe it doesn't. I think a lot of people probably don't think it does. It's not been. I would say it's a controversial book in some ways because I think it doesn't necessarily tally with the common sense view, I'd say, that a lot of us hold around screens. So what I was trying to do with the book is really, I wanted to say push back then, but not necessarily, but push back against some of the prevailing narratives around screens. Because when you look at how we talk about screen time in its various forms of definitions in the media and just in the general public debates around it, there's very often quite simplistic narratives there, very confident narratives there. But actually, when you start looking at the science behind some of those claims, it's never as clear cut. It's never as simplistic as is often made out. So the real science part of the book title was that really just trying to figure out, well, let's take some things that we think of as given around the screen time debate, and let's actually look at the science behind that, and what does the science actually tell us, and what can we glean from that in a useful way to try and feel a bit more empowered about some of these conversations and hopefully make some more informed decisions about our own tech relationships.
Okay, and I know Sydney's going to jump in here in a minute, but before Sydney does, can you give us some kind of examples? What are some of the things you found that you think people might commonly believe about screen time, but the science says different?
I don't think I've seen in the past year a news article about the bad side of screen time that doesn't talk about them being addictive. They are not. Clinically, there is no such thing as smartphone addiction or screen addiction. There is video game disorder, is the one, what you might class as a digital addiction, that is formally classified in ICD-11, which is the International Classification of Diseases that the WHO uses. Even there is a lot of debate and disagreement amongst scholars as to whether this was the right thing to do a few years ago and whether actually we've got sufficient evidence to support that sort of view. If you look at the research in that area around digital screen-based addictions, is very, very messy. Nobody has stopped at any point and gone, hang on, is this an actual disorder that we're talking about, or are we just assuming that it is because we use the word? And that's bled into the public narrative. It's part of a wider issue around digital technology, which is that we don't really have a good vocabulary to talk about it. So we use certain words and certain phrases that maybe mean one thing, but can be misinterpreted to mean another. And an addiction is one of those. So we talk about things being addictive when we never actually mean clinically addictive. We mean we feel like we spend too much time doing that thing, or we feel like we're overusing it and it's not good for us in some ways. But these things become, they become, what's the word? Told you my brain's not going to work today. They become all this is what's having kids has done to me. Those things become mixed up and conflated, and in terms of the public debate versus the research literature, we see real overlaps there. We see these cycles of people talking about a digital addiction or a screen addiction in kind of public conversations, and then researchers coming along and going, everybody's talking about this thing being addictive. We should look at that. But they go from the starting point of this addiction exists. Let's characterize it and see how many people have got a problem with it, rather than from going, does this thing exist? So I think that's one of the big ones. Various sorts of common sense views around screens that we talk about in the book. I think one of the other ones that I talk a lot about recently is attention spans. So there's this received wisdom that our attention spans are being ruined, and that this is directly linked to our screen-based lives. And again, there's no good evidence to support that, really. As with many things in this space, the conversations always end up being really messy and a little bit nerdy, because you have to get into the details of, well, what are we talking about when we mean attention span or screen time even. And sometimes I think people see those as quite nerdy deflections almost from the real issues, but actually they're really important to trying to figure out what's going on here. And I think attention span is a great example of that. That everybody knows that our attention spans are crashing, that they're 8 seconds, and that's less than the attention span of a goldfish. Everybody knows this because we're told this all the time, but it's not real. Like, these are not real numbers. These are all zombie statistics that were essentially made up about 10 years ago. But because they're easy to digest, and because we can relate to them and they feel scary, and we've all got lived experience of having bad times on our phones, so we feel that there's something not great about technology, that we buy into those stories a lot more easily than when somebody comes along and says it's really complicated, because that doesn't fit as easily with our worldview.
Yeah. I really love in the book, you mentioned zombie statistics and these kind of, you also do a really good job of discerning between like anecdotal information and true factual information. And that's something that I've always struggled with, because as someone who is in the field of mental health and social media, what tends to populate or become viral is very different than like actual facts that are rooted in science. And so I'm kind of wondering, when you're seeing these two different areas, kind of like bad science happening, but then also online misinformation happening, when it comes to solving that problem, do you have a sense for who should be responsible or who should be trying to take more care? Is it the scientists, or do you feel like it's more of a media problem?
I think in many ways it's a great question. It's sort of like a collective action problem in many ways. That I think if you try and pin this down on, it's this group, whoever that is, it's big tech that needs to fix this, or it's government that needs to fix this, or it's us as individuals that needs to fix this and do something differently. I think all of those are true, and if you try and kind of focus on one specific angle, it lets the others off the hook in a certain sense. And I think that's true not just of problems around misinformation. I think it's true of a lot of issues around digital technology and the perceived impacts on it, and the real impacts of it. I think nobody in this space is saying that everything's absolutely fine and there's nothing to worry about online, and let kids do whatever they want. Nobody is saying that. It's absolutely not the case. There are some real issues that we need to tackle, but we're not at the minute, because we're constantly in this state of panic. That there's this very fear-based narrative around screens that's been around for years now, and for me, it goes back decades, potentially even. That certainly in the UK, I can remember stories from 10, 15, 20 years ago where well-meaning people who were scientific researchers in a particular field, for whatever reason, were getting worried about some form of screen-based technology, whether it was computer games or whatever, and they had positions where they could talk about this in the mass media, and very specifically said, they were using this to sound an alarm about screens, but the stuff that was coming out just wasn't born out of science. It wasn't born out of evidence. Literally the reason that I became a science communicator was because of this sort of stuff. I can pinpoint it to a news article in 2011. And the headline was, "Computer games leave children with dementia, warns top neurologist." Nothing about that headline is true.
Yeah.
There was no research to support that. There is still no research to support the idea that early onset dementia happens in children if they play computer games. And the person who was saying it wasn't a neurologist; they were a neuroscientist. It's a different thing, but nothing was right about it. So that's a bit. It's not quite what you asked me there, I guess, was it? But I think these are problems that we've seen for a long time.
Yeah.
And what happens is, because they've been going on for so long in this sort of fear-based way, it leaves people with this general sense of panic where you feel like you've got to do something now, you've got to do something quickly, urgently. And when somebody starts coming up with what could be a very reasonable solution that puts the onus on big tech or puts the onus on government or whoever it puts the onus on, it allows us a moment just to go, okay, it's them that need to sort this out, when actually it's all of us need to understand what's going on a bit more, so we have that knowledge to be able to hold the right people to task and actually make the changes that we want. If we go around panicking saying that screens are bad for everything, actually nothing changes, nothing gets fixed, because those are very easy arguments to ignore because they're not grounded in anything like reality.
Absolutely. Yeah. It reminds me a lot of kind of the push for banning phones everywhere, and kind of the argument that it doesn't allow for the conversations about phone usage to take place then.
Hey folks, Nolan Higdon here, interrupting real quick just to ask a favor. Can you please like, follow, comment, and subscribe to the podcast? It really helps get the show out to more people. If you also have a couple extra bucks in your pocket, please consider becoming a paid subscriber. You can go to patreon.com/Disinfo Detox, and you become a paid subscriber for as little as $5 a month. It really helps get the show to more people, allows me to bring in more people and create more content. You can find a link to that in the show description. All right, let's get back to the show. And I've followed this debate for a long time about whether or not screens are addictive or not. What do people in the industry think? Because at least from the kind of whistleblowers I've talked to, or people who work in the industry, they talk about how like the dominant platforms, whether it be social media platforms, search engines, marketplaces, all the FANGs, they're always trying to design their platforms in a way that keep people on as long as possible, taking ideas from like the gambling industry and others. So does the industry think it can get people addicted? And is it that attempt to get people addicted is why people think screens are addictive? Or can you speak to any of that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I think it goes to a crux of a lot of the issues here that, if we're talking about actual, proper, full-blown clinical addiction, if you talk to doctors and neurologists who deal with that on a day-to-day basis, I've got a colleague in the US, in the UK, who does this. She works in a hospital. She works with people with addiction. She has written a book about phones and about how they're very good habit-forming devices, and how if you're not happy with the habits that you formed around phones, here are kind of ways in which you can address that. There's nothing to do with addiction, because she's very clear. If you see somebody who's dealing with an addiction, this is not what we're talking about when we're talking about phones and screens and things like that. So there's a book called The Phone Fix by Faber Getty, and it's really good. It's really, again, a sort of really empowering book to read that doesn't scare you, but gives you things that you can work with in your own life to deal with the things that you're not happy with. The reason I was saying that is that if you design a product intentionally with the aim, knowing going into it that it's addictive, and intentionally trying to make it addictive or as addictive as possible, it's a really bad business model, right? That thing is going to get regulated out of existence pretty quickly, and that's not what we're dealing with here. So I think the problem we're talking about big tech is that it's not this homogenous thing, right? It's a beast with many moving parts and many different people that work within it that all have different goals, names, different levels of responsibility and accountability. And there are some people who work in tech companies, particularly in trust and safety teams, who really care deeply about this stuff. They are trying to do the right thing. They are trying to figure out how do we make our online world safer for everybody, not just for kids, but with a particular focus on kids. Very often they don't talk to designers necessarily, where there are different incentives for what needs to be done on a particular day. And I think potentially a good example of this is it kind of comes from the gaming world. So I've done work on loot boxes in video games, which a lot of people are worried are basically a form of gambling because they look like gambling, they feel like gambling. It's basically this idea of you play a game and you can spend a little bit of money to open a box that has a randomized chance of getting something either really boring and really common that everybody's got, or is very, very rare, is usually called legendary. So it sounds even cooler. So there's a lot of desire attached to that thing. And because you can potentially spend an infinite amount of money on these sorts of things, there's no kind of way to fully complete a game because you can always add more stuff that you can download via loot boxes and stuff. You can potentially spend money effectively forever on this. They do look a lot like gambling, and they do lean into a lot of psychological vulnerabilities that are similar ones to those that you see in casinos, for instance. But when you look at kind of the evolution of how that came about, it's not the case that somebody in a room in a games development house said, okay, we're going to make this as addictive as possible because we want everybody playing this game and only this game. It's different. It's more long term than that. It's reliant on understanding how the economics of the games industry shifted from physical formats not really being economically viable anymore to the proliferation of the internet, explosion of fast broadband speed internet, making it easy to deliver stuff digitally that removed a lot of the costs that you had as a developer. And then sort of trickle effect where the next thing is, well, we could deliver games where we can add things on, additional levels or additional sets, downloadable content. And you see this sort of gradual shift into what we call these microtransaction models. So at no point is it ever that somebody's going, oh, addiction is a good way of getting lots of money out of people in a completely easy to do and morally unquestionable way. Let's just do that. It's when you look at let's try this sort of monetization mechanism. Let's see what happens in terms of our daily active users or monthly active users, the amount of time that people engage with games. These what seem to be seemingly innocuous metrics that are used within the industry, those go up, and it looks as though you're doing something good from an industry perspective. More players are engaged with the game. They're spending more days in a row on the game. They're spending more, but maybe they're not spending too much that you would necessarily worry about it. I don't know. But none of those measures tally nicely with what we might broadly call well-being or mental health.
Yeah.
You can see kind of corollaries of that in other areas of the tech industry, that there are measures and metrics that are used that look like they might be good from an industry perspective, but they might not very, very much not be good from a mental health or a well-being perspective, but that's just not part of the conversation. It's not part of the thought process.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the people who are thinking about that, who are in a company or in a particular area or working for a particular platform, either might not have the ability to talk to the people who are developing it, or certainly not have any clout or overarching responsibility for that. So it then really becomes a sort of higher and higher level issue. Right? And that's why it's sort of it's really difficult to just say, oh, this is the thing that we could change, because it's not entirely clear who's got responsibility for that or how you change it. Now, none of that is me saying, well, we shouldn't bother. It's too late. It's just for me, over the past 5 to 10 years, I've gone from somebody who said a lot of this stuff. Said things like, the games industry needs to change the way it monetizes its games because these things potentially are not healthy for people. Whether they are or not, they're not a fun experience. Fundamentally, they're against the whole point of play. They make play all about extrinsic motivations, and we do know that that's got a negative relationship with well-being. It's less about playing things for the fun of playing. I've been saying those sorts of things, and actually, it can be quite a naive way of barreling into these sorts of conversations. Because when the next step is you go, okay, well, how do we do this? How do we figure out how to get the data or the sort of research that we need to actually nail down, is this a problem or not?
Right.
And I go, well, you should share all your data, and I want data that looks like this. Then you start to realize, well, there is data in the industry that might help, but it's not what you think it is, and it's not what you think it looks like, and it's massive, petabytes of information. So it's not as simple as saying, "Oh, just share your data." We need to think really hard about how do we create the data that we actually need to answer those questions, to figure out where the problem is. And it's really hard to have those conversations when everybody's shouting at each other, saying that everything's bad and screens are causing all of the bad things that you can think of. Because what that means is that it makes it harder for researchers to engage with industry. The first question that I get whenever I talk about this is, who funds you? And to be fair, it's a reasonable question. You should kind of check the provenance of money and conflicts of interest and things like that. I don't get money from any tech. I don't get money from anybody, really. I'm not paid. I wish I had a grant to look at this sort of stuff, but I don't. I get paid by my institution to do that job. But it sets up this very kind of toxic environment for the conversation, because you can't go and talk to, if you find the right person in a games development house or on a social media platform who can, in theory, can enable you to get the data that you need, there's all sorts of NDAs associated with that. And then there's all these sorts of conflicts of interest. But just the sheer fact that you're seen to be talking to industry can be seen in and of itself as a conflict of interest, where you're seen as being compromised. And we're not going to get any further down through these conversations if that's where we're at with thinking about how to interact with industry. They will disengage. They will pull products from different regions because that's easier to do than to change it. And we've seen examples of this starting to happen already over the past few months, but even over the past few years, in terms of, again, to go back to loot boxes. When the Belgian Gaming Commission basically banned loot boxes a few years ago, EA just pulled entire games from that region because it was easier. It doesn't massively affect their bottom line, and it was easier to do that. And actually, when you follow up a few years later, there's been really great research by Leon Zhao about this, looking at adherence to loot box regulations. A lot of the time they're ignored because those regulations don't really have teeth. So it's a really complicated, I know I've waffled a little bit here, and veered off from the original question you asked, but these things are really complicated, and there's lots of parts, which is sort of why it means that we've not moved things on much yet.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like I kind of wonder if you could speak to, because I think about this constantly in my work, and I think obviously one of the biggest hurdles is to get people to not see cell phones as villains anymore. But if that were possible and we were to kind of get people to stop seeing them that way, do you have any advice or any insight in what you think would be a more healthy relationship that we could cultivate with our devices?
I think it's very individual there. So I think this is one of the major problems, is that you can't really provide population level prescriptive advice here, because there might be kind of very reasonable specific needs in a particular community. Even if you're just looking at rural versus urban populations, there will be different needs and different use cases. I think where you can try and generalize a little bit here, and this is something that I talk about a little bit more in Unlocked, is trying to shift that frame of thinking around what the nature of the relationship is that we develop with technology. So, we all, like I said earlier, we all have kind of bad experiences or unhappy experiences with tech. For most of us, that's fairly banal. For me, it's things like wanting to go to bed at 10 o'clock, but just sitting down to look at a few Instagram reels, and then the next thing I know, it's like midnight, and I'm like, oh, I can't do that. For other people, it's incredibly serious, and there are some horrific stories out there of how things can go really badly wrong. But I think, where I'm talking about it in terms of the vast majority of cases where we've all got these experiences of feeling as though we spent too much time on them or not had a good experience when we didn't want to, it's in those moments that we start to think, oh, this is, it's because it's addictive. It's addictive by design. This is something that's happening to me. Those can be very disempowering thoughts and messages when we hear them from the media. A better way of thinking about our relationships with phones or screens more broadly is that, again, like I hinted earlier, they're very, very good habit-forming devices. We literally are creatures of habit. We find it very easy to fall into relatively automatic behaviors. Usability and UX design of digital tech facilitates that, not because they're trying to be addictive necessarily, but because they're trying to make this an effortless experience, a useful experience. And what that means is that if you're not thinking about what we call like intentional use, if you're mindlessly scrolling basically and picking up your phone when you don't really have a need to, that's when problems can start kicking in. So the thing about habits is that in and of themselves, they're neutral. Whether or not they become good things or bad things depends on other factors and the kind of context of the situation. So the example that I use in my book is, literally just checking your phone is a habit, and it's a neutral habit in and of itself. It's not inherently good or bad. If you're checking your phone in the evening because you're feeling lonely and you want to connect with friends and message them or do a video call, that's a really nice, good habit to get into. If you literally one of the worst habits that you can get into with checking your phone is checking your phone when you're in a car and you're driving down the road.
Good example.
It's one of the cases where we have a very clear, direct link between a negative outcome, a negative health outcome in terms of car crash and death, and technology use. There are huge numbers of cases across the world each year, increasingly so, where this happens. So then we need to start thinking about, well, what is it that shifts the balance from a habit becoming good or neutral to bad, or vice versa? And there's various lines of thinking here, but one that I talk about in the book is sort of frequency of unintended use. So when you're using your phone in a way that doesn't align with any particular goal, the more frequently you do that, the more likely you are to encounter a situation where something bad happens. So if we carry on with the example, if you're checking your phone lots and you're not doing that for a particular reason, you're not doing it because you need to check your work email or whatever, you're just doing it because you've fallen into the habit of checking your phone every few minutes or whatever, at some point you're going to have a bad experience, whether that's you're checking your phone while you're driving down the road in a car, or again, I talk about this in the book, you're mindlessly scrolling through Instagram when actually you don't want to be, but you're in it now and you're just scrolling, and you come across some content that you weren't expecting that really upsets you. And it might be innocuous content. It might be that sort of content for somebody else is perfectly fine and they don't give it a second thought. But for you, because of your situation and your past or whatever, that's really upsetting. And then you've had a bad experience. So trying to catch yourself in those moments is the first step to changing it. The problem with habits and the problem with this whole way of thinking about it is that habits are really hard to change. And just noticing them is the first step, but isn't the magic fix. There is no magic fix here. If we want to change the relationship that we have with digital tech, it's going to take intention, it's going to take time, and it's going to take effort. So you've got to want to do this. And you're going to want to think about, well, what is it that I want to get out of my tech use? And when you start doing that, you can start, hopefully, it's not about removing the tech at that point. Because when you remove the tech, when you go for these sort of very blanket type bans, you lose all the good stuff as well as the bad. And you don't necessarily lose all of the bad stuff as well. But instead, thinking about this in a more kind of effortful way, it does take a bit of time and effort to do this. And it's not just something that you do once, you've got to do it continually until you change those habits and those new, better habits become automatic. But trying to catch yourself in those moments, and when you've had that bad experience, go, okay, what was happening that led up to this? Why did I get into this? And what can I do differently next time? So, scroll on Instagram at 10 o'clock at night is a good, easy example of this. Like, why were you doing it? What did you want to do? What can you do tomorrow night instead? And just try experimenting with different things. And you're not stopping scrolling Instagram completely, because sometimes you might enjoy doing that. You might kind of find funny things to watch or whatever. But you're thinking about what is working best for you in those different sorts of situations.
All right, Detoxers, you've been listening to Sydney Sullivan and I interview Pete Etchells about the book Unlocked, The Real Science of Screen Time and How to Spend It Better. Pete, where can folks go to get the book and follow more of your work?
So it's, I don't know when this is going live, but it's nearly out in the US. So I thought it was going to be out on the 12th of August, but it's coming out in physical format on the 19th. It is already out digitally. You can get it from online bookstores. I'm not sure whether there'll be that many physical copies available around the US, but it is available if you kind of look in the right places, I guess. I'm on most social media platforms as Pete Etchells, so I tend to be more active on Instagram nowadays. And my website is peteetchells.com.
All right. Thank you so much for coming on the show and writing the book. It was great to chat with you.
Thank
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. All right, cool. Thank you. We'll add an outro.
Yo, Detoxers, this is the Disinfo Detox. Want to keep media literacy alive and kicking? Chip in at patreon.com/disinfodetox. Broke? We get it. Just like, comment, follow, or share. Even your hate helps the algorithm. Thank you for supporting the Disinfo Detox, where media literacy meets breaking news.